Truth Espresso, episode 90.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Hey there, Truth Espresso fans. This is Daniel Minnick, your host, and welcome to this different episode of Truth Espresso. This episode is a little bit of a break from the series that we're doing on identifying who Jesus is via superheroes. And so as we identify who Jesus is in this episode, we're going to take a break from that and deal with another issue concerning identity. And this issue in particular is dealing with what is called the Equality Act that has passed the House of Representatives in the United States on Thursday, February 25th. And for this episode, we welcome back my beautiful wife, Chelsea, as a guest on Truth Espresso. Chelsea has talked about things from medical perspective, a woman's perspective, dealing with issues like abortion. And the last time she was on, we talked about COVID vaccines and Christian conscience. But here to chat with me a little bit about the Equality Act is Chelsea Minnick. So, Chelsea, welcome back to Truth Espresso.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be back.
So, let's see, the Equality Act. So why shouldn't we just support an act based on its name here? It's called the Equality Act, and we're for equality, right? I mean, equality is a good word, and you know there have been struggles with equal rights in certain things for men and women, like equal pay for equal work and stuff like that. So if it's called the Equality Act, why shouldn't we be in favor of whatever is in the text of this act? So what do you think, babe? Should we look into this act and really see if it's a good thing, or should we just, say, hey, we're for equality, so go ahead and pass it?
Yes, what is the saying? Don't judge a book by its cover. In this case, we're not going to judge an act by its cover or by its title. We definitely need to be wise and look into this and read what the act actually entails, because there is a lot of harm that actually can come from this so-called Equality Act.
So let's dig in deep a little bit into this Equality Act, and we're going to look at some of the text of it. Now, Chelsea, you have read the Equality Act, correct?
Yes.
And so have I. So both of us have read the full text of the act. Now, it's not like this humongous thing that would take you a few hours. It's not like 200 pages. It takes about, I'd say, 15 minutes, and a lot of it is a good deal of boredom, talking about changing language from one verbiage to another. And so what is the meat of this Equality Act? Well, really, it's just a change to the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and allegedly to update it with the times, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was intended to end the discrimination there against things like sex and race and religious preferences. And so that if you're going to be hired for a job, like, say, I as a software developer, I shouldn't be discriminated based on my faith or the fact that I'm male or that the color of my skin. And likewise, if someone has a different skin color or different religion or is a female or whatever, whatever. They should just have equal access to a job as I would, or to go shopping someplace, eat at a restaurant. So it seems like this act is supposed to be a good thing, but the Equality Act is an update to the Civil Rights Act to change some of the language, to add to it, or to redefine some terms. Now, the focus of the Equality Act is centered around the word discrimination. It makes a lot of use of this word discrimination. Now, is discrimination, the technical definition of the word, always a bad thing? I mean, we have to discriminate when we choose what clothes we want to wear, what food we're going to eat, where we plan to go to college, what major we want to take there, what job or career we're shooting for, what car to buy, where we want to live, and so on. We make value judgments, and so in the process we discriminate. And the government does an awful lot of discrimination, because it seems like most activities right now on the free market, for the most part, don't actually discriminate for the reasons that the Civil Rights Act was intended to prevent. Naturally, a lot of employers are just looking for someone who has the skills to do the job. They hire based on who will do the work. But then the government is what constantly discriminates, because you think of all the forms that you have to fill out that ask for things like gender and ethnicity. I don't advertise that on my resume. As I apply for jobs, I would normally just submit my resume and cover letter, but then comes the government forms that ask for my gender and ethnicity, and am I a Pacific Islander, African American, an Asian, or a Caucasian, or some forms ask if I'm Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or Latino. So it seems like the government wants to treat these things as important, where other people who are not in the government don't really see things like that as being overly important. But what does the Equality Act say at the beginning of it? For its purpose, it says, quote, an act to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes, unquote. So the focus of the Equality Act is to go beyond the original ethnicity, sex, according to biological sex, and religion, and things like that, and it just focuses on gender identity, orientation, and things that are primarily in the mind of someone, how the person chooses to identify themselves. And so, babe, what do you have anything to say about that? Is this something that's long overdue, that we add to the Civil Rights Act as a matter of civil rights? Do we need to protect people based on how they identify themselves by their perceived gender?
Well, this is definitely an interesting addition to the act that was first inscribed. So it seems that it's very dangerous to have it open-ended to where anyone can identify themselves as anything they want or anything they perceive themselves as. So that can go a long ways as far as someone who is a pedophile, or they want to identify as that. Then all of a sudden now we have to not discriminate against them. So it just seems like this is really going to open up a huge
Pandora's box.
Yes. Pandora's box, thanks. Of just allowing anything and everything.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. The way I'm trying to think about it, the purpose of the Civil Rights Act originally is to recognize that there are indeed differences. You don't discriminate based on these actual differences. You don't treat them like, okay, so someone has a different ethnicity or different skin color. You're not blurring that away. You're recognizing that because there are differences, you you don't impose things such as job offers and, sales of goods and services based on criteria that are recognized as actually different but are not relevant to those types of activities. But in the case of gender, so the original act says you don't discriminate based on sex because there are two sexes, and you don't deny females things that are not really specific to males. Like you don't discriminate and say I'm only going to sell this to a male when it has nothing to do with maleness at all. Like someone, say if someone's being chauvinistic. So the idea of not discriminating is by recognizing that there are distinctions. So does redefining sex via the Equality Act into the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what does that do to the idea that there are, in fact, these biological distinctions that, we're not supposed to discriminate in certain ways based on the fact that there are distinctions there? But what is this going to do? I mean, aren't there biological differences between male and female? Do you have any input on that? And since I'm a biological male and a husband and father, you're a biological female and a wife and mother, there are obvious differences for how we have our 4 kids, and, you have femaleness, I have maleness, and, so can you speak even to things that are biological that we might not even think about or know unless we study the science? Like, so what are some more biological distinctions between male and female?
I am very glad you asked me that, because it's actually really interesting once you start digging into looking at the amazing way God created male and female and just the tiny little differences that you would never think of, down to little receptors on muscles that are different between males and females. So females can recover quickly from muscle fatigue, where males have a longer time recovering from muscle fatigue. So it's just, absolutely amazing to see how God designed male and female and just the differences between the two. A few just to point out that was very interesting. Males tend to have a bigger brain in total mass, and their brain interacts more in specific regions. So if you've heard of any comparisons of the different ways males and females will think, males, sometimes they're considered thinking in a box, or also that their brains are kind of like waffles. Well, that is kind of the case in how their brain actually functions, that they will go from one spot to the brain to the other. Whereas females, they tend to have interaction crossing both hemispheres, and quite quickly too. And another interesting thing I saw was that in females, the hippocampus part of the brain is actually a little bit bigger, and that's where you are learning and memorizing information. And it actually works differently than the male as well. And something else that, I know we talk a lot about just something that you can notice different between males and females, with males being more logical and females being maybe more emotional. If I'm stereotyping that, I don't mean to, but there is actually biological evidence for this. So the female is actually able to remember and recall emotional events more than a male would be able to. And because of that, females are actually more prone to depression and anxiety. Depending on what article you read, they're 2 to 4 times more likely than males to struggle with that. And then on the other hand, with males having the more logical and the origin specific part of their brain functioning at a higher level, they are more inclined to have struggles with autism and being on the autistic spectrum. So just very interesting, just from the brain perspective. There's all these different details that really show there's a difference between males and females. And that's how God designed it. God designed it not to be this one's inferior, one's superior between the two genders, but we actually complement each other. We help each other where one might be lacking, the other one might be able to come and help in that area.
So that's some good scientific information there, babe. And of course, you know that there isn't a vanilla male and a vanilla female. There's a lot of personality distinctions. And, if you want to use the term spectrum, there are flavors of maleness and flavors of femaleness and stuff. It's not like a black and white thing. There is overlap in activity, and makeup. But if you use the law of averages, there are differences in the averages of the way, you said autism or logic or, feelings and stuff like that. And that's based on biological distinctions, as you said, and how the brains are designed. And so, to ignore that is to ignore that at our own peril. Now, let's get more into the Equality Act. The Equality Act appeals to the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So, what does the 14th Amendment say? It says, quote, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." There's an historical context to that because the 14th Amendment was passed after freeing the slaves during the Civil War time. Continuing on, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." And now I'm going to read a portion of the Equality Act that appeals to the 14th Amendment and note some of the subtle distinctions there. So Section 2, subsection A.10 of the Equality Act says, quote, "Discrimination by state and local governments on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, and public accommodations and in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States." Of course, I would say that at the time of the 14th Amendment, I don't think anyone was thinking about federal financial assistance in the way it's just flippantly done today. But nevertheless, moving on. Quote, "In many circumstances, such discrimination also violates other constitutional rights, such as those of liberty and privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment," unquote. So, did anyone hear anything about privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment? No, it says life, liberty, or property. It says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." So why is it adding privacy to this? And of course, it doesn't want to mention property, which I think is important. Life, liberty, and property seems to be something that the person would own. Life, you don't kill. I'm thinking of abortion here that the Equality Act seems to want to deny to the unborn, and we'll get to that later. And then the Equality Act fails to mention the word property because it seems to want to deny people property by forbidding how you can use or dispense of your property. If you want to give it or sell it, it should be your discretion. But of course, the Equality Act seems to want to say that you have no right over your property, because if it can be found that somehow allegedly you have discriminated, then, you have no right to your life, liberty, or property if allegedly you've discriminated against what you yourself own. So if I own property, can I not choose to sell it or not to sell it, or to give it away, and to whom? If I own a business and create products, which is my capital, my property, I can decide whether to sell it or to whom to sell it, right? And then, if we look at the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, remember freedom of speech. Oh, but wait, that doesn't work anymore because, you might discriminate with your words. Freedom of the press. But what about this? If we can have groups and associations that require members to be certain things, say biological women, women's rights groups, and so on, and those groups do activities like canvass and sell things only to other women, is that a bad thing? What about the First Amendment right of, quote, the right of the people peaceably to assemble, unquote? And in the case of this Equality Act, to petition the government for a redress of grievances, do we get that? So I would say we don't need the government breathing down our necks, whining about so-called discrimination, when there could be perfectly valid reasons for wanting to associate or do commerce based on certain commonalities. But now, let's really get into the meat of this act. Section 3, subsection A, point 1 of the Act, of the Equality Act, this is where the Equality Act is updating the language of the Civil Rights Act, and it says, quote, in subsection A, if this is a point 1 in the Civil Rights Act, point 1, in subsection A, by inserting, quote, sex, parentheses, including sexual orientation and gender identity, close parentheses, unquote, before, quote, or national origin. So what it's saying is that, okay, where the Civil Rights Act has the word sex, the Equality Act is defining sex or reinterpreting the word to mean including sexual orientation and gender identity. And you see a lot of that if you read the Equality Act. So we can't discriminate based on male and female, but now we have to accept that male or female could mean anything. It's just how the person wants to identify that way. And the Equality Act includes this with teeth. It says in point 4 of subsection C, section 3, it says, quote, any establishment that provides a good, service, or program, including a store, shopping center, online retailer or service provider, salon, bank, gas station, food bank, service or care center, shelter, travel agency or funeral parlor, or establishment that provides health care, accounting, or legal services, unquote. And what this is doing is saying that no discrimination is allowed in any of these situations, in any of these types of organizations. It's basically trying to say anything here. And so what do you think about that, babe? I did emphasize shelter, and I did emphasize establishment that provides health care. So how does that impact, say, women's care? Because that's what you're wanting to do. You wanted to do women's care, but what about caring for women's needs? And what about shelters? And how is that going to cause a problem if someone could be a biological male and identify as a female, and you don't want to discriminate that? How is that? Could that cause a problem? Could it backfire? Are there unintended consequences there?
Yes, I think this is the part where it really shows the true colors of what the act is, and that it is not for equality. It is going to actually cause more harm for women, and I think we as women need to stand up against this act and the men that love us too, because this is going to put women back in harm's way again. You cannot have a women's shelter where women need to get away from abusive men and then allowing men who identify or claim that they're women going into these shelters, because that is not providing a safe place for them. And then also with healthcare, I'm a women's health provider. My job description means I can only care for biological women. I can't care for men unless I'm treating for sexually transmitted infections. Then I can treat men for that. But now, okay, am I going to be held liable for discriminating against treating for men? And it's just very crazy. We need to definitely stand up against this because it's going to cause a lot of harm.
So, I mean, what's so hard about treating, doing prenatal, postnatal care for a transgender woman? Like, you mean there's a little bit of difficulty there? I mean, why is that something that you wouldn't be able to do with your women's health care? And like, could you do ultrasounds and see the, how far along the baby is with a transgender woman, you think? Or why is that a problem? Obviously, I'm being a little bit sarcastic.
Yes, just a little bit. Yes, there are some very obvious reasons why I would not be able to do women's health care for men, because they are physically different. Men do not have a uterus, and like there are different anatomical body parts, and that would be a different line of care. So yes, that wouldn't really work that way. It is interesting that some people don't realize, but there are quite a few hormones that are in both men and women. Like men have the estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. They're just at different levels than women. And women also have the estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And so some people think, okay, if we just alter those hormones, then we can make a man who wants to be a woman more womanly, or vice versa. But looking at all the biological implications of that, that's not how that works. You can't just make someone into a different gender by altering their hormone levels like that. It's way more complicated. And that's because we had an amazing God who designed us and created us with so much detail. So I don't know. It's just interesting. Thought I'd just throw that out there.
Yeah. So, it's like just putting a little chimney on a car doesn't turn it into a house, like things like that, like, okay, doing these slight little alterations, cosmetic alterations or, things like that doesn't turn something into something else. God has designed, as you said, a lot of intricacies into the distinctions between biological male and female as he intended, and just identifying doesn't make you the other thing. That's not to that's not to ignore the fact that there are people who in this fallen world struggle with figuring out, who they are as God has made them. And that, it's not to say that we should just treat the problem like it and dismiss it. It's something that we do need to address as Christians and care for people, but caring for them really shouldn't mean like affirming a problem as a good thing. We want to help them with the problem and deal with it, and not, we don't want to hate on one side, but we don't want to champion something on the other side that could be destructive. So, in the Equality Act, it defines gender identity because it uses that term in updating the Civil Rights Act. So, it defines gender identity as, quote, "The term gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth," unquote. So if I just put on a long-haired wig and put on a dress and try to talk in a high voice, is that good enough to make me a woman? You know?
That's kind of a scary picture in my head.
Yeah, it's a scary picture in my head, too.
That's
so
good.
I agree with you there, babe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, like you pointed out earlier, that just changing the appearance doesn't change the entire biological part of you that is still very much male. And I think that it's kind of a discredit to males and females when people try and think that they can be the opposite gender, because there's a whole lot about men that females can never fully understand or comprehend. There's a lot about females that a male could never fully comprehend or understand. Males do not have their menstrual cycles every month. There's no way a male could understand what a female goes through with that side of it. And males have their own cycles of hormones and issues that a female would never understand. So I just think you're right. Putting on the wig, talking differently does not make you the other gender. It does not even make you understand the other gender either.
Yeah, and then so allegedly with this Equality Act, you know, there's supposed to be the idea of cisgender versus transgender, stuff like that. So it's like, how can you legally distinguish, because it mentions appearance and mannerisms as gender identity. So how do we distinguish between a cisgendered person acting in defiance of their biological gender versus a transgender person who legitimately identifies with the gender that is opposite their birth? Because obviously there are complications with that, because we know that there are men who take advantage of women and children and stuff like that. There are problems with that we can't discount, you know. And then, as you mentioned there, you know, we'll get into some of those problems there. So what I'd like us to do would be to get into that topic in the next episode. Just how does this anti-discrimination law allegedly deal with discrimination, and how would there be any adverse effects on how this would end up treating women and children? I mean, could there be really devastating negative effects toward women who've worked so hard to get recognized with their appropriate rights as human beings, and children protection from those who might be masquerading under the opposite gender for self-centered and exploitative reasons? And so as we end this episode, I would like to plug a promo for Andrew Rappaport's The Rap Report on the Christian podcast community.
Andrew Rappaport's Rap Report is a podcast providing biblical interpretations and applications. It is a ministry of Striving for Eternity and part of the Christian podcast community. We provide a biblical view of cultural events, discuss how to apply God's Word to the Christian life, address issues that concern the church, and we even take some time to offer a correct understanding of those commonly misinterpreted passages of Scripture. You will hear from great guests like Justin Peters, Todd Friel, J. Warren Wallace, and Gabe Hughes. Andrew has the Rap Report Daily, which is a 2-minute Monday through Friday podcast, and then the longer Rap Report podcast for more content. Subscribe to both today by searching for Rap Report on any podcast app, spelled RAPP Report, or click the podcast link at strivingforeternity.org.
Can you answer the following questions for your children or for the person to whom you are witnessing? Number 1, is the New Testament reliable? 2, can you explain the Trinity to me? 3, how is Jesus both God and man? And a slew of other questions you will be able to answer if you get Andrew Rappaport's new book, What Do We Believe? It will help you a ton. Get your copy at whatdowebelievebook.com, whatdowebelievebook.com.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.